So everything is laid out in Ableton's Arrange view. I'll be using Ableton as my DAW for the creation of all the elements, and then I move over to UAD's Luna DAW for the final mix tweaks and the master chain. So you'll see here we have some grayed out elements and some elements that have colors attributed to them. The ones that have colors are the final elements, and you'll also see here a clock out, and that is for my modular system. Now the elements, you'll see we've only got 9. This track is going to start out as basic as you can get, just a kick and some percussive elements, very simple patterns and samples. And then we get into slightly more complex territory. I create some custom toms using a filter module. And on the full tutorial, I do zoom in on the module and show you exactly how I created it. And then we just have one main sound, and it's all about the processing and the tweaking of that sound as the arrangement goes along. Once again, this is from my modular system, so I'll be zooming in and showing you exactly what I'm doing when I'm tweaking the modular. So that's pretty much it, just 9 basic elements. Now, a lot of these elements are audio that have been bounced down from the creation stage. So the grayed out elements here will mostly be the same elements, but when they were in their MIDI stage. And the reason I like to bounce them down to audio is to save on CPU, because I've used quite a lot of plugins, and also it helps make decisions quite early. So you'll see I've done that on the kick, for example. If I play the track now. Okay, so we'll take the kick first of all, and if we go to the final kick track here, it's just got a VU meter to check my levels, and the creation of the kick goes on down here in the grayed out area. That will be a repeating pattern in this tutorial. So the kick is a group, and it consists of 2 kick tracks. The first one provides the transient impact at the beginning of the kick, and I explain how I used a reactor ensemble to do that part of the kick. That part in itself has 2 layers. We have the actual kick sample, and then we have a layer which I've got a slow attack and a very fast decay, so you get like a reverb tail coming off of the initial transient. And I go through exactly how I create that, and then I merge that with a sample, a kick sub sample, and this comes from Wave's CR8 sampler. And all I've done is simply done a reverse fade, so to get out of the way of the initial transient that I've already got from Reactor, I've done that fade so the sub fades in and doesn't clash with the initial transient. I've chosen CR8 because I wanted to show the free accompanying app that you get from Waves Audio. You can get them separately. Cosmos is free, and CR8 I believe is $30 or something, so value for money. Whenever I use a third-party plugin, by the way, wherever possible, unless it's doing something really unique and specialized, I do explain that you can use an alternative, and I have done some alternatives as well, and I'll go through those in the full tutorial. Using Cosmos, which basically searches your entire computer for every sample and then groups them together, and you can search for them by entering certain keywords, and it will even group them in key and BPM for you. So a lot of the percussive elements I found just searching through my sample packs, and that's exactly how I came up with this one. This is fairly basic at the moment, and it gets more involved as we go through the tutorial. Alright, now the shaker, pretty much the same process. If I go down to the shaker, again I used CR8 until I came up with a shaker sample, and again you can see here I've got a choice of 2, and that is me coming up with an alternative sound just to show you different options throughout the tutorial. Right, if I go back to the beginning of the track now, we go to something that I have left in MIDI just to show you the patterning. The closed hats, if I open up the MIDI here, I go through how I create the pattern by just experimenting, trial and error, with the randomize velocity feature in Ableton Live. And then I explain why I've done two different patterns, one before the breakdown and one afterwards. But very basic stuff. Again, it's just a hi-hat that I got by searching the Cosmos database and then dragging it to CR8. You could, of course, get Cosmos and search for your samples and then drag them into an Ableton drum rack, for example. Right, so the toms, as I briefly said, this came from my modular system, and I explained in the tutorial, by going down to the grayed out toms area, you'll see here I've used Ableton Live's CV tools to just send a gate pattern to the filter, and I'm hitting the highly resonant filter and it's coming out with a lovely percussive deep tom tone. And I actually do two run throughs, one an octave lower to get like a subby part of it, and I do drop down to the sub part for the breakdown. There you go. Okay, and then we have a clap element, and that was as basic as can be. Again, I used Cosmos just to search for a perfect clap sound, and I just dropped it as a single hit actually, and then the rest of it is just whacking a reverb on it. Now, reverb comes from Unfiltered Audio's Tails. Nate does a fantastic tutorial on Tails for Sonic Academy, so if you want to get the deep dive on that, go and check that out. It's a fantastic dual engine reverb, and I've used it a couple of times throughout this track, but you can of course use Ableton's convolution reverbs. You know, there's certainly no reason why you should stick with what I've used. Okay, let's continue on with the track, and let's get to our ride section, because once again I use a different technique to get the ride. And yeah, I've used Machina here, and I've dragged 3 different ride samples into slots and using exactly the same, just a very simple pattern there on the 1 and 3, with the 1 slightly lower in velocity. And yeah, just to get 3 different options, you can right click and just choose which one you like best. You could of course fill out the entire 16 slots with rides and, you know, drive yourself crazy trying to choose between them. But I explain how I've done that and then bounce them down into audio, and I'll explain how I do this little technique of doing a pitch ride up and down just to build into the drop down. It's got a pumping compressor on those rides, and also tails again, a tiny little bit in the mix just to give it a bit of space. In the full tutorial I explain how I did everything that I've explained so far in the clip session window, and then drag everything over to the arrange window, drag everything out to 5 or 6 minutes with everything going. None of this was dropped out, none of it was arranged. I just wanted a good 6 minutes to record in our main sequence and tweak it as the track went along, keeping in my mind how the track will develop and that I will need a breakdown at some point. So that's what I did, and then I went over to the modular, and I do show you on the modular how I come up with this lead sound. You can see there's quite a involved plug-in chain, but nothing too complicated. I think nearly all of it is stock Ableton plugins. And what I thought would be interesting to do is to offer you a completely alternative way rather than using a modular. Not everyone's got a modular system, of course. So using the very similar sequence pattern, that is a 7-stage sequence, but using a plugin. So I went to Newfangled Audio's Generate. There is a free version of this with a smaller feature set, but go check that out just to show you that you don't have to have a complex oscillator in your modular system, or even a modular system, to be able to come up with one of these dark techno type of sounds that is really in fashion at the moment. So all that is offered, complete alternative way of doing things, a completely alternative effects chain. As we go through the effects chain with the original sound now that I did finally choose, you can see here mostly Ableton stock effects. These are coming from their delay suites like freezer fading, and in most of these cases they're just presets. There's no real complex sound design going on, just a bit of Melda Productions filter to add some variation, some sweeping little dip filters, so to add some really subliminal alteration to the track as it continues. And then a delay from Ableton, it's Echo plugin, which is fantastic. A free plugin which I've used for the huge reverbs in certain places, Valhalla's Supermassive, again completely free. And I explain how I've used the DS Tantra to come up with the breakdown, and slightly after it gets all glitchy. That's using DS Tantra. And now you can probably hear a metallic pad sound coming in, and that's the other side of my effects chain. And that is because I have the dry signal, none of it going through this effects, that's just the raw signal again going through a granular effects plugin from Arturia. If I solo that, and I explain exactly what it's doing in the tutorial. Okay, so that was pretty much it for the creation of the main driving sequence sound. You'll see we've got no sort of bassline, pad, string, melodic sound type arrangement here. This is strictly percussion and one main sound that is doing all the heavy lifting in this track. So once that was in place, it was just a case of doing an arrangement so that I had an idea where the breakdown was, and I could start building a very simple breakdown. And it's just got two elements. It's got this metallic hit which comes in, and I go through how I selected that using a CR8 sample and then added the free Supermassive afterwards. And then I use my Waldorf Iridium Complete Overkill, because really this is just a noise that has been filter swept, and you can use any noise source for that. It's just I had my Iridium on hand next to me and I could do it by hand, and I explain how I create that lovely tail. If you can see the noise sweep, the MIDI there actually stops dead, and then you just get that lovely delay and reverb carrying over into the latter half of the track. So that was pretty much it. That's the arrangement side of things. And what I do next in the tutorial is switch over to a more intermediate level with some mixing. So here you'll see that I've exported everything out of Ableton and imported all of the individual sounds into UAD's Luna for some mix tweaking, just to get that final 10-15% extra quality into our track. I've done some further tweaking to the tracks themselves, but nothing too drastic. I've added a little filter sweep using FabFilter's Micro. You can see there just for the intro. So instead of our main sound starting off really full, you can see now it's got a low pass filter on it, and as the track begins it steadily rises. That's a common technique in this particular genre. I've also added, if you listen to the kick now, wanted to fill it out a bit more in the bottom end, so it's got a nice delay, and I explain in the tutorial exactly how I use these filters in combination with the feedback to get the right amount of repeats without making the track too muddy. Then I flip over into the main mix view, the console view as it were, and I go through each individual track, and where I've done some EQ changes, like on the kick I've got an API graphic EQ just to accentuate the upper end, and I do some A-Bing just so you can hear how the track has improved since we imported it from Ableton. If I play our kick and then I drop out the EQ, And I'll just go through various examples for each of the effects that I've added to our particular sounds. For example, on the toms, I was still not quite happy with the toms, the balance between the upper octave in the toms, which is, you can clearly see on this analyzer here, and the subby element of the tom. I wanted it to be more subby still, so I just reduced the amount of the higher octave layer there. I go through some saturation plugins such as Black Box, tiny amount. I explain about how I prefer to do very small incremental effects rather than anything really drastic. That goes through an auto panner, a dual auto panner. Again, I don't go through any real detail on any of these third-party plugins. They are not tutorials on the plugins themselves. It's just I briefly explain what they're doing in the context of the track and try and offer an alternative for you so you don't have to feel left out if you don't have these particular tools on hand. I've got some passive filter usage here, just rolling off the top, a very lovely smooth passive filter emulation to make the top end not so harsh. We go to the clap and I explain how I use Eventide's omnipressor to now make those claps sound absolutely huge. Compare that with huge amount of compression that really squashes that transient, and then the compression fades away and it lifts up all the lovely reverb tail and it just makes that effect even more dramatic. I've got a little bit of phasing on the ride, again very subtle amounts. If you open up the amount of mix, you'll see I've only got it like 8%. All these little subtle effects build up and make a real difference in my opinion. Again, omnipressor on the metallic hit just to make the reverb really drag out as long as possible, and the same for the noise source. And on our main sequence sound, I have just done some low pass filtering to smooth off the very top, and then just putting it through a vintage limiter, but not actually doing any limiting. It's just the tone of the box. And I explain that most of the selections that I've chosen are presets. A high-end compressor, and again I explain exactly what I'm using the compressor for, and you can of course use any compressor that you've got in your arsenal. That's the filter sweep that we had from the intro, and finish off with a tiny bit of mid side. I'm pushing the mids in the air, so the mids will be brighter and the sides will have that a little bit out of the way, so you get a really nice centralized sound. Again, everything quite subtle, nothing too drastic. I explain how I create a couple of buses. The kick and the toms are merged together, basically just so I can keep an eye on their levels. If I put them both together, the levels are, once the kick comes in, you see they're just tickling the reds, which is exactly what we wanted, and the over peak LED isn't on, so everything's nice and safe as far as gain staging goes. And then I've got a drum bus. All the percussive elements are going through this drum bus, and they are being glued together, doing very little compression. You can see just a little bit of action on the needles there. That's an engineer's trick for this particular compressor from Neve. And then I've got the metallic hit and the noise sweep, the breakdown, basically just going straight to the main out along with our main sequence sound. I added a reverb, and I go through the type of reverb I've used and this little industry trick using a certain preset called Mythical 3D. This is FabFilter's saturation plugin called Saturn 2, and it, even though it's really a subtle amount, it really makes the reverb surround you. It's just a great preset. And finally, I finish off with some pretty advanced plugins, and I avoid going into too much detail. I just basically choose my favorite presets from some high-end plugins from Plugin Alliance, doing some saturation and boosting the low end and the very top, and then the Overstayer MAS from Softtube, and I explain how I emphasize the bottom end and smooth out the very top, and then using the another super high-end compressor limiter from Weiss, and that does a trick which no other plugin manages to do by compressing a certain frequency selection only, and I use that just to compress the very low end and then boost it, and it just doesn't affect the rest of the track. So pretty advanced stuff there, but I don't go into too much detail on each plugin. I basically just go through the concepts of why I've done them. And then finally, I have a little discussion about whether you should send it with lots of headroom to your mastering engineer, which I think you should, or, you know, I know mastering is quite expensive these days. If you don't want to go that route and you want to do your own digital master, which really is about creative choices, whereas vinyl mastering is more of a definite skill, you can use Ozone's maximizer on the end, and I explain about the amount of level for this particular genre. Okay, I think that is it. So you've got basically 2 stages to the tutorial. It's all over on Sonic Academy's site. And don't forget to check out all the other amazing content on Sonic Academy. There are so many fantastic tutorials on how to make certain genres, and also a lot of these plugins that appear in this tutorial have been featured, fully deep dived by guys like Protoculture, myself, and many others. So go check out Sonic Academy, and yeah, I hope to read your comments on what you think of the track.
Thanks everyone for watching. We really appreciate the support from you guys. If you liked this video, then you know, smash that like button, and if you want to be notified about new content, hit the subscribe and the bell notifications. Peace!